I like, what I like, what I like. Joining the show once again is Ward Churchill, who is a prolific American Indian scholar and activist. He is a founding member of the Rainbow Council of Elders and longtime member of the Leadership Council of the American Indian Movement of Colorado. In addition to his numerous works on indigenous history, he has written extensively on U.S. foreign policy and the repression of political dissent, including the FBI's counterintelligence program operations against the Black Panther Party and the American Indian Movement. Churchill has written over 20 books, including Fantasies of the Master Race, Struggle for the Land, On the Justice of Roosting Chickens, From a Native Son, Critical Issues in Native North America, COINTELPRO Papers, Indians Are Us, Agents of Repression, Since Predator Came, and A Little Matter of Genocide, Holocaust and Denial in the Americas. 5 of these books have received human rights awards. Professor Churchill, welcome back to the program. Thank you for taking the time.
Not a problem. I'm glad to be here.
Well, so I contacted you most recently to talk about this issue that I find most troublesome and offensive, this notion that has crept up yet again of, in this case, black buying power. There's almost an annual report that comes out that is put together by the Selig Center and picked up by many, for instance, Target Marketing Group and several other marketing companies, and picked up by the national press, and is promoted and suggests that if black people were their own country, they would be in the top 20 in the world in terms of national economy, and more or less just don't spend wisely and end up back in the same kind of poverty that is often more popularly discussed. So in this most recent iteration of this report, it's argued that by 2017, the Black American national buying power will reach $1.3 trillion, and were people to invest and spend wisely, they would be much better off. So I've tried to deal with this in a number of instances, but what I found most interesting this time around, and I don't remember seeing it in previous reports, though I don't deny that it was there, is that they're arguing that Native America is now on the list of emerging so-called minority groups, and will soon have a national have their own buying power of $96 billion, suggesting again that right, if Native Americans simply had better financial literacy, they too would be better off. So I know you've written a lot about the conditions, not only of indigenous Americans, indigenous people here in the Americas rather, but national political struggle, dissident struggle, as we said in the top. So I wanted to ask you about this. I also know specifically in your book, Struggle for the Land, I don't remember the details, but I do remember specifically reading in that book where you really went meticulously through the places where Native Americans are in this country, talked about the resources that were coming out of those communities, none of which was being used to benefit them. So I definitely wanted to have you on and ask you what you think about this notion of buying power for these so-called minority groups, including now Native America with $96 billion national buying power.
I do believe that my belly laughed when I heard the number, sort of spoke for itself, but let's put it this way. You got roughly 2 million, a little over 2 million people recognized by the federal government as being American Indians. That's official. That's an tribal enrollment and all the blah, blah, blah that goes with it. It doesn't have to do with the census data. Okay? That's what the federal government officially counts as being American Indians. 2 million people. $96 million in spending power would mean they were fabulously wealthy.
And that's billion. I'm sorry. That's billion, not million. 96 billion.
Yeah. 2 million people, $96 billion. You do the math. You know, you're not quite talking Bill Gates rich in terms of per capita, but you're talking well into the 1%, very top layer of the 1%, the top 100th of 1% in terms of individual wealth. Okay? The poorest county, bar none, in the United States for the last 60-odd years has, with about 3 or 4 years exception, in Shannon County on the Pine Ridge Sioux Reservation, per capita income of less than $3,000 per year. What kind of spending power do you get there? And if those people are that poor, and that's a goodly number of American Indians right there, you know, how much more wealthy do individual Indians have to be to compensate to drag the number up that far in terms of spending power? When Shannon County was not the poorest county, there was a county on the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation. Both of these are in South Dakota. Okay? So Shannon County is not atypical of the Sioux complex of reservations. They're all that poor. In fact, very narrow range of differentiation. The entire Northern Plains complex of reservations, all the peoples up there are running not all that far off what I'm talking about. We're talking unemployment rates that are running 75% and up. On Pine Ridge, it's running right on the 90th percentile. And it's been that way for generations. There are no jobs to be had. There is no income, therefore no disposable wealth for purposes of spending power, period. So the numbers are ludicrous on their face, but you have things that the federal government does to keep Indians in this condition. You know, they run programs. The Indians have no control. The Indians are not spending that money. The federal government is spending it to maintain this particular system of wealth expropriation. They funnel the wealth off into the general population economy, the overall U.S. economy, at the expense of Indians. And it's fairly pricey to run the administrative and police apparatus and so on that makes that possible. So they're counting that expenditure over the objections of Indians as being Indian spending power, is the appearance to me. But spending power doesn't really tell the story. Since 2008, you made reference to the data on black folk. Well, black people, overall, as an aggregate, median family wealth has plummeted to $5,000. That's per family, as an actual accrual of wealth, assets worth $5,000. That's not because of poor spending, and I'll tell you how that works. It's not because everybody's going out and having gourmet dinners and buying Cadillacs that depreciate, or BMWs or Jaguars or whatever that depreciate the moment you drive them off the lot. I'm living in a black neighborhood in Atlanta, Georgia right now. Okay? Moved down here from Colorado. Getting back actually to home country, but that's another story. So I'm in the black area of Atlanta. Atlanta has been recovering from the collapse of the housing market. Housing prices for the city as a whole are up 15% for the year because of the city codes for the inner city, which make it cost prohibitive, virtually impossible for bureaucratic reasons for people to improve their properties in order to rehabilitate, that is, make livable the place I bought. Ultimately, step by step, they forced me to essentially rebuild the whole thing. So I got about a $300,000 building investment here that was just appraised at being worth $129,000. So you spend money for housing, and they immediately depreciate it by well over 50% as a matter of course. Now, what exactly are you supposed to be doing to spend your money wisely under conditions like that? If it's in the black community, it loses value before you even get done buying it. And we're talking real property here. That's how the net value of the holdings of black people in the United States went right through the floor. Far more loss of median wealth in the black community than in any other sector of the U.S. population, with the exception of American Indians. And American Indians had no wealth of the sort we're talking about to speak of to begin with, so there really wasn't much of them to lose. They've been pressed as a people or peoples into the depths of poverty for the entire 20th century, and in a lot of cases before that. That's an endemic situation. It's a structural situation, and coming out with just bizarre numbers like that is an obfuscation. It's a mask designed to hide the structural reality of how the U.S. system works.
I tried to point out that a lot of the data that they get, that they use to reach these conclusions are, in the case of past studies at least, as they say in their own language, they come from what they call comprehensive surveys of American, in this case African American and apparently Native American consumers, and then decide that after all expenditures, that these people, as you pointed out, still have money left over to be spending all this kinds of money. So one of the things that I always wanted to ask, to try to, as you also mentioned the structural nature of all of this and the fallacy that this is a result of a poor financial literacy among these communities, is that, so for instance, if magically speaking, Ward Churchill were appointed the singular leader, or at least treasurer, of all of Native America, and was given this $96 billion, and you were given $96 billion, and then you said, well, I'm now going to invest, I'm going to buy some land, I'm going to buy, I don't know, some stock or something that would be considered capital or an asset, so to speak, financially, to what extent would you even be able to? In other words, to what extent would those in power be willing to sell to you? To what extent is there any land or stock left on the market to buy? As if there's all this wealth creating opportunity sitting there, and people are just choosing to spend, well, at least in terms of the black stereotype, buy fake hair and rims. And I guess Native Americans are, I don't know, is this supposed to be $96 billion of alcohol or some other sort of stereotypical spending pattern, bad habit in these communities? You see what I'm saying? I mean, like this idea.
I do see what you're saying. Yeah. First, I'd have to see where the hell the $96 billion was. I think maybe the first thing I would do would be put every American Indian in the country on a personal, per capita basis, okay, on $1 million a year income. And then I take the other vast preponderance of the billions of dollars and do something like you're talking about. But the fact of the matter is, the basis for that kind of spending power, as they call it, flatly does not exist, as near as I can tell.
Right.
Even on all federal programs, with an exorbitant overpayment for, the story of the $10,000 toilet seat and things like that, which were not Indian choices, and Indians aren't spending that money. It's being said, quote, in their behalf, end quote. Even with all of that, I don't believe they can actually support that number, that $96 billion. In other words, I do not believe it exists in the first instance. But if hypothetically somebody wanted to hand me the $96 billion and say, here, you're in charge, well, let's just make every American Indian in the country tangibly rich and see what they do with the money. Meanwhile, I'll start buying back stolen land, I guess is the way to put it. Land that was never lawfully taken in the first place and passed over to white settlers, by and large, for a song, has not really been, quote, developed, end quote, which means kind of destroyed. They put an infrastructure on it, but you got vast chunks of terrain, particularly in the West, that have never so much been touched other than maybe power lines run across them here and there, some back county roads and so forth. Pay the inflated price, for the land that was taken essentially for nothing. But what would happen at that point is that whatever I paid for the land to aggregate it for indigenous usage would be immediately devalued on a dollar economy to 50% or less of what I paid for it. So that would be a net loss. If I spent $96 billion on land, aggregated it so that it could be used for economic development purposes by American Indians, its dollar value, not the intrinsic value of the land, but the dollar value would plummet by 50% or more. And that's the phenomenon I was talking about of making an investment in the black neighborhood in an urban area. You're spending the money as you should be spending the money, but they devalue the money, the property you receive in exchange, so that you incur essentially a net loss before you even start. You're spending, no doubt about that, but you're not getting what the general population gets in exchange for what it is you spend the money on.
Yeah,
Hard to accumulate wealth.
No,
on a median basis, a per capita basis, or any other basis when the structural circumstances are such. So what I'm going to have to say is that the recourse would have to be to alter that situation for the people who are on the receiving end of this sort of discriminatory structural reality to step out of the dollar economy altogether. We're measuring the value of things in terms of dollars, which is an abstraction. What's the actual value of the land? What can you do with it? How do you sustain yourself on it? Now, that's fairly clear with regard to what we're talking about with American Indians, with land on which you can graze, you can grow crops, you can do various things. Harder to peg in terms of an urban context, but there's ways that could be done there too. Service exchanges and so forth. People are experimenting with that, and they have for a long time. We're also captivated by the magic of the monetary system, that we forget that money in and of itself has no value other than exchange value. And when they structurally rig the exchange value against you in the way that I've been talking about, you really ought to seriously think about the extent to which you can step out of that into another sort of set of economic relations where you actually get the value of what you're doing in exchange for what you've done.
Even in the article that I was initially critical of, at the same time that they're saying black people have this $1 trillion of spending money that they misuse, it cites in its own body, it cites research that shows just sort of what you're talking about, where as soon as black people buy a home, it devalues, it loses value arbitrarily in the way you're talking about. So I mean, it's saying even if you spend it wisely according to their standard of spending, as you said, it's rigged. The construct of money and the construct of value is rigged against these communities. So I mean, it
inflates continuously in the white suburbs. I mean, it took a hit during the housing bust, but it's recovered by and large from that. And it's in the process certainly of recovering. White periphery, the suburbs of Atlanta, are gaining in value steadily, while the inner city goes steadily down further and further and further. And you cannot improve the properties without having a major expenditure in your hands because of the city building codes and paying for inspections that don't really occur. 11 or 12 of them for a minor project. First, you got to get the permits. You're required to have the permits on the basis of a teardown order. Okay, and then you have to pay for every inspection, including when they lose the paperwork and they have to do a second inspection. You're getting charged every single time for that. Well, in a lot of contexts, that's all the money that people had to try to improve their living conditions in the first place, you see. So it's a structural barrier there as well. It's regulatory and it's structural in terms of the overall economic indicators, the appraisals and so forth. Make it impossible for people to maintain, much less increase their net wealth as a result of their spending. Part of which assumes that they have disposable income in the first place. Right. And you've got a whole lot of folk in this lavishly spending community who are in prison cells, who are homeless, who are, structurally disemployed to the point where they're not even part of the count on unemployment statistics and all the rest of that. And to be talking about these startlingly large numbers, I mean, larger than entire third world countries, as being the spending power of communities of color in this country, is just, outrageous. It's like the notion that if you cut taxes, you generate more income. As a government, there seems to be no end to this sort of bizarre alchemy that right-wingers in particular in this country would like to make these incantations and have the opposite of everything be true.
But that's also one of my problems, and why this issue has been one in particular for me has become sort of a pet peeve, is that because it's not just the right, it's a lot on the so-called left who pick this mythology up and run with it and use it as a way to chastise the communities they claim they're representing, or to balance their own supposed left-wing analysis of the economic system by saying, yeah, but even with all of that, if we just spend our money better, we would still be okay. And it's just Yeah, so for that reason, I
Yeah.
mean, it's even for me worse than when just Fox News or somebody wants to run with it, you know.
Well, the terms are kind of slippery here because what is being passed off as left-wing analysis is center-right.
You're right. That's right. No,
You
you're
know,
absolutely
you've got
right.
the radical sort of Nazi right, and then you've got it counterbalanced by a right-wing centrist. That's the counterbalance. Well, that's not a left. Okay, and I don't think if you got any bona fide left analysis going on out there, then you come across it from people like Chomsky and so forth from time to time. But that's not ever the people who are being heard.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got right wing and you've got further right wing analysis.
Mm-hmm. No, that's right. That's exactly right.
That's how you end up with a sort of consensus. Okay, you have a measured, reasonable sounding analysis juxtaposed to a more extreme formulation of the same analysis. That's what fallacies for interpretation of reality through the media. And I'm including the blogosphere and all of that
right.
in the media.
You know, you mentioned earlier that you now live in Atlanta. You're moving, as you said, closer to home country. And I didn't want to leave this conversation without at least bringing it up a little bit, why that move took place, or at least one of the major reasons for the move. I guess I don't know all the reasons that went into it, but and the issue that you had with, or rather the issue that the University of Colorado had with you. And it's and I just wanted to say that I not only interviewing you a couple of years ago when I think this was at the earlier stages of it, but in the years since I've tried to follow the case, and I've read at least somewhat deeply into a lot of the statements and arguments that you've published and others have published, and I tried to follow the American Association of University Professors argument to the extent that they got in it, or the Colorado chapter got into it. And one of the things that I just found is a nice summary of what was concluded in your case, and then I'll invite you to say what you like about it, because as someone in academia, as someone who is supposed to be theoretically protected by tenure, and as someone who is, as someone once put it, politically out of the closet. I mean, I did personalize, and I selfishly looked at your case, you know, in consideration of just where I fit into all of this, and others like me fit and like us fit into all of this. Obviously, you are more prolific and more prominent, which is even more frightening in terms of the outcome. But I found in a statement on your case that Richard Delgado, famously of Critical Race Studies, summarized. He said that in responding to all the things that had happened to you, aside from the decision of the university, that you were hounded, deprived of speaking opportunities, of course, reviled on Fox TV, forced to step down from your department chairmanship, your life was threatened, he says, and your car was defaced, your career ruined, that it illustrates, he says, two principal contentions. One, that America Brooks... illustrate two of your principal contentions, and he summarizes that by saying, America brooks no dissent, is cruel to its enemies, and does not fight fair or even abide by its own rules, end quote. So I say that to invite you to say something about what happened and where you are, and what does this all mean in terms of what is supposed to be freedom of speech or academic freedom in the United States.
Well, what happened in my case is that I publicly stated that people who starve babies in order to maximize profit, who chain children to machinery or assembly desks in sweatshops in the third world to increase profit, who engage in essentially the infliction of massive miseration on brown-skinned, black-skinned, non-white, in any case, people of color, as the case may be, all over the world for purposes of increasing their own profitability and prestige, all the perks that attend that, who have a, quote, quality of life that is maintained on the basis of that, are the moral equivalent of Adolf Eichmann. I said that in conjunction with the attacks on the World Trade Center on 9/11, and that upset a lot of people because, of course, by definition, if you're American, you're innocent. You could be Charlie Manson, apparently, and be innocent of anything and everything on that context, which is exactly what they were saying in 9/11. Well, that'll never do. You call things by their right name, and there's pushback. Well, not necessarily. If you pick some figureheads as being responsible, so you can do this sort of rotation well, culprits routine that's been going on forever. Well, it's the president and it's key people in Congress and it's CIA officials and it's, you can name all of the villains, the usual suspects, who are in continuous rotation. We need to vote them out. Vote the scoundrels out and change the policy. Well, the policy's not going to change, and you just shift almost effortlessly into condemnation of the next figurehead. But guess what? It's not those figureheads who are out there doing this stuff. You know? They formulate policy, they sign papers, they front for the policies, but you got actual technocrats and bureaucrats who are sitting there making the system run. And you got, beyond those technocrats, that core, technocratic core of empire, as I call them, you've got a whole lot of other people embracing that, who are bought into that, who are applauding that, who are voting for that in this charade we call social change, electoral politics. You know, elected Obama, how's that working out for everybody this week? All right? Just the latest in an endless string of the same sort of masturbatory electoral change-rendering political alternatives to the status quo, which just result in maintenance of the status quo. Okay, you say something like that, you bring responsibility to bear on the nameless, faceless, yuppie cast of characters who make this all work. You lay responsibility on rank-and-file soldiers. You lay responsibility on the rabid folk who are going to the polls to vote for time after time after time after time. You hold them accountable, and all of a sudden, there's this pushback. Well, the pushback in my case was to contrive a series of charges and findings of research misconduct, as they call it, academic fraud, and so forth. Okay, to push me out of my job. That was the consequence I was to pay. And incidentally, along the way, they said, hey, you'd like to apologize for this or change or point out where you were wrong, or, you know, all of this can go away. Well, I speak the truth as I see it, and that was the truth that I saw. And I'm not going to back off that. I'm not going to bend. I'm not also going to break. So I got pushed out on the pretext of academic misconduct, sued him, went to trial, won a jury verdict. Jury said, nope, wasn't about research misconduct. In fact, one of the jurors after the trial said they didn't have a single witness that we didn't catch lying in order to make the case in the entire course of the trial, which lasted for 4 weeks. So that was a unanimous jury verdict that I had been illegally fired. The response to that was the judge vacated the jury verdict on grounds that they were quasi-judicially immune from consequence. So there's no question that they violated my rights in order to punish my exercise of free speech, academic freedom, all the rest of that. Okay? You have a jury finding to that effect, but there's no consequence that will be visited because they're immune from consequence because they're a government entity. Now, think about that for a second. The Bill of Rights exists in the Constitution of the United States, hypothetically at least, to secure the rights of the individual citizens against actions by government. But increasingly, and this was just the latest example, the courts have ruled that governmental entities that are violating rights are quasi-judicially immune from any consequence of their act. So essentially they can sit there, and that's zoning boards, boards of regents, parole boards, bureau of prisons, endless list. They can sit there, openly concede that they're going to violate your rights, have violated your rights, and there's nothing you can do about it. You have no judicial recourse. Took that all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. Okay, Supreme Court declined to hear it. But basically that's now doctrine, at least in the Supreme Court level of the state of Colorado, that little things like tenure have no meaning at all because at their discretion, the Board of Regents of any institution of higher education can trump up a case and fire. Usually, I guess they wouldn't even have to create a pretext now. They can simply fire you because they were offended by what it was you had to say as a faculty member. They could do that. And they're quasi-judicially immune from any kind of judicial recourse. So, yeah, tenure and $5 will get you a cup of coffee at Starbucks. That's the upshot of it.
Well, tenure maybe $10.
Maybe $10, Starbucks. I don't know. I don't buy my coffee at Starbucks. So, I was just popping wise there. I want to make it clear. I want to make one thing clear, That's not why I'm in Atlanta. I didn't leave. They weren't going to run me out, But I'm not getting any younger. And if I was ever going to move away from where I was, it was time to be doing it. I'm 66 years old next week. I waited another 4 or 5 years. I don't think I'm going to be doing any moving across half the continent to set up shop again. So it was a sort of now or never. I moved only within the last year, so the whole thing we're talking about in Colorado started in 2005. I was there for quite a while. And I wasn't leaving until it was clear that I had won to my satisfaction. Okay, the jury verdict was one piece of that, and the Colorado AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, so did a really in-depth. It took them 3 years to complete it. They went through the record with a fine-tooth comb, and they not only confirmed what the jury had concluded, but added detail that I had engaged in no research misconduct whatever, period. But that the investigative committee, the professors who formed that at the behest of the administration, had engaged in every single activity that they found me guilty of. That is fabricating evidence, falsifying evidence, omitting evidence that contradicted their preordained conclusion, that they had violated process by turning a supposedly objective fact-finding exercise into an adversarial context, that they had brought in a woman whose main expertise or competence to be on the committee at all was that she was a former prosecutor, and that she had informed me the first day because they had provided me with no standards that I was supposed to frame my replies in, academic standards. What are the rules here that I'm supposed to have complied with? There's several sets out there. I'm an interdisciplinary scholar, so it could have been any of the several sets. And they refused to identify any. And I said, well, how am I supposed to respond to this? And she said flat out, you should view yourself as a defendant in a criminal proceeding. Now, that's about as adversarial as you can get. So there was no due process. There was no wrongdoing on my part, but there was an absolute subversion of due process on an institutional basis. And that's the conclusion of my actual academic peers, if you will. People who had some competence. And there were ethnic studies and American Indian studies scholars and others. You mentioned Delgado. He's a legal scholar. But there were quite a number of others who had looked at that and arrived at the same conclusion without doing the intensive, detailed investigation of what had happened that the AAUP did. So, I made the point, and I've got a life to live. I'm not going to stay there just to prove some kind of an arbitrary point. You can't run me out. I stayed until I felt I had established that, and then I moved to where I was more comfortable, which is down here.
In the piece I quoted where Delgado made that comment, it's actually in an essay written by Derek Bell, and that essay begins with him saying that freedom of speech is, as he puts it, time sensitive. In other words, in certain places in time, it works, and in others it doesn't. And obviously,
it's an interesting point. I'd like to insert there that Derek came all the way to Colorado to be a witness at my trial, and the trial judge refused to let him testify, despite his obvious competence in the constitutional issues involved, on the technical legal ground that the judge, not the witnesses, instructed jurors as to the law. Then he comes up with this quasi-judicial immunity thing, so you can see why I did not want Derek Bell testifying. But
right. Not only right. No, I mean,
he's a legal scholar, but he's not allowed to testify.
Right.
Nor was he allowed to testify on the topic of academic freedom, in which he has some, had at that time some vast wealth of experience.
No, I was just going to say, for those listening who are not familiar with this case in particular, or this side of the academic world at all, that again, I read a lot of this stuff actually, and that you're talking about, and it was remarkable not only to read it, but even in your, I mean, because it's so much, worse and detailed than obviously you can quickly summarize here. But even with what you did summarize, I mean, it was really egregious that the people who were selected to judge you weren't qualified. They changed the rules. I mean, the landscape was shifting all the time. I mean, it was remarkably clear that, and including with the piece you just added about Derek Bell's inability to testify, that this was like you said, a preordained, prejudged judgment, and it was farcical. I mean, it was, and unfortunately led to what happened to you. And I appreciate you clarifying why you ended up, part of why you left, and I didn't mean to suggest that they were running you out. I just, anyway, was looking for a clean.
That was intended for the listeners out there, No, I don't want anybody being confused about that.
No, I appreciate
my family's land, where we were situated before Andrew Jackson's little real estate transaction, was about an hour north of Atlanta. So I know where my family's land was. I can go to literally on home ground.
Right. Well, just lastly speaking, I know time is running a little bit short, but I did want to ask you, you mentioned that you have a birthday coming up, and we wish you a happy one and many more. But unfortunately, your birthday and others' birthdays are not celebrated as others are, or landmarks in your life's history are not celebrated as is the case with others. And I know that I felt the first chill in the air. The leaves are starting to turn, so I know what's coming next in the next few months, and a lot of misrepresentation.
Well, they'll call it Indian summer, won't they?
Right. So, in advance of that, knowing that you're busy and we won't always get to catch you exactly at the right moment, but I mean, it's always timely to hear what you would have to say about, Columbus Day and Thanksgiving, and what you have been saying for many, many years. But in advance of yet another season, what would you like to say for the 2013?
Well, Columbus Day, quite simply, is a celebration of genocide. It would be as if Germany had invoked an Adolf Hitler Day, that's perhaps not fair because Columbus was not head of state, although he thought he was in the Caribbean. He was the viceroy, so essentially he was functioning in that capacity. But certainly, if Germany were to celebrate Heinrich Himmler Day every year, maybe on Himmler's birthday or something, that's the nuts and bolts of it. And, you can imagine, well, the resonance of that's more extensive, but you can sort of imagine how Jewish people would feel about the celebration of Heinrich Himmler Day, the guy who presided at the very top of the hierarchy that ran Auschwitz and Treblinka and Sobibor, and so on and so on. That's how American Indians feel with respect to the celebration of Columbus. You're celebrating our destruction, our genocide, our eradication, 90% of our population or more, the loss of our homelands, ways of life on a number of cases. So that absolutely catastrophic event is being commemorated from an American Indian point of view. You can go on to that one they call Thanksgiving, and I'm not sure who's giving thanks there. Certainly not the people who fed those pilgrims with agricultural products, by the way, that the Europeans did not know how to grow. They weren't even aware of the crop types for the most part, So there goes the myth of the savage hunter-gatherers that Europeans were encountering when they entered this hemisphere. Okay, corn, beans, squash, pumpkins, all that. You don't go out and hunt and gather. You got to grow it. But those are the very same people that fed the so-called pilgrims were slaughtered by those pilgrims within the next 20 years. Wampanoags, Pequots, Mystic Massacre, really gruesome stuff. That's what's being commemorated there. Hey, everybody's entitled, I suppose, to make mistakes. I'm not talking about the pilgrims being mistaken about slaughtering the Indians, those acts of genocide. I'm talking about the Indians making a mistake and haven't fed them. They should have starved those suckers to death and pushed them into the sea, and world history would have been a lot better for it, so say I. But that's the kinds of things that are celebrated by the settler society as a matter of routine, a triumphalist celebration of their own conquest, extermination, and ultimate colonization of an entire hemisphere with the peoples. Me, I see nothing to be proud of, and I see nothing to celebrate in that. And those who do kind of fit my little classification of little Eichmanns. Not adverse to a good meal, but not on that day for that reason.
Ward Churchill, I thank you very much for joining us. And just to wrap things up where we began, we can at least say, but thankfully, despite the history you just recounted very quickly, Native Americans can look forward to the $96 billion buying power that they are said to now have. So
that's it. We're all going to go down and go bowling, by golly.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on, sir.
No problem. And more information can be found about Ward Churchill at wardchurchill.net, and we'll certainly link to it at imixwhatilike.org. Thank you very much again, Professor Churchill, and we thank you for your time and wish you the best. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like.